The terminal went quiet around them. Cheryl Tacta felt the boarding pass go damp in her palm before she understood why. A man in a high-collared black overcoat stepped into her path like he'd been standing there the whole time, waiting. 6 men in identical dark suits closed in behind him, silent, unhurried, like they already knew how this ended. Jack's small fingers dug into the back of her coat. The man's gaze dropped to the boy, held there a beat too long, then rose to meet hers. "He isn't going anywhere with you." His voice didn't need to be loud. It cut through the announcements, the rolling suitcases, the hum of Incheon International like all of it belonged to him. Cheryl's stomach dropped through the floor. She had never laid eyes on this man in her life. "Don't scroll past this one. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. Hit like if you're already holding your breath, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Let's get into it." The departure board above Gate 15 blinked Seoul to Chicago, delayed, the red letters stuttering against the fluorescent ceiling in a way that made the whole terminal feel like it was holding its breath along with her. Cheryl had been counting the minutes since sunrise. 35, maybe 40. 35 minutes until she and Jack were airborne, until Seoul shrank to a memory outside a tiny window, until she was finally somewhere no one was watching her. The bakery was sold. The apartment was empty. 5 years of building something from nothing, folded up into 2 suitcases and a 5-year-old's hand in hers. She had told herself this was the smart move, not the scared one. But for weeks now there had been things she couldn't explain away. A black sedan idling too long outside her shop window. A courier who came back to the same corner 3 mornings running, never delivering anything. A silence on the other end of the phone that lasted just a second too long before it hung up. She'd blamed it on stress, on raising a boy alone in a country that still sometimes made her feel like a guest in her own life. But 9 days ago, the feeling had stopped being vague. It had become certain. Someone was watching her bakery. And worse, someone was watching Jack. So she'd done what any mother would do. She'd run. Standing in the departure hall now, Jack's fingers curled tight around hers, she let herself feel it for just a second. Almost gone, almost safe, almost. "Mommy," Jack's voice was thin, small, tugging her out of the thought. She looked down. His eyes, dark, watchful, older than 5 years had any right to be, were fixed on something over her shoulder. "Why are those men looking at us like that?" She turned, and the floor of her world gave out. He was maybe 20 feet away. Tall still, wrapped in black wool that fit him like armor. His jaw was cut from stone, his hair combed back and severe, and where his collar shifted she caught the edge of something dark curling up his neck, ink, old and deliberate, like a warning written in a language she didn't speak yet. He wasn't moving. He wasn't blinking. He was simply looking at her son like he already owned him. The 6 men behind him mirrored his stillness exactly, the kind of quiet that isn't calm, it's coiled. Travelers parted around them without seeming to notice they were doing it, the way water bends around something it instinctively knows not to touch. "That flight is delayed because I bought every seat in first class." He said it the way other men might comment on the weather. Cheryl's arms tightened around Jack until he made a small sound of protest. She opened her mouth, to scream, to run, to demand security, she didn't know which, and that's when he said the thing that would end the life she thought she was flying toward. "That boy has my blood type, my jawline, and my dead wife's eyes." The words hit her like a slap she never saw coming. Her ears rang with them even as her arms tightened around Jack, pulling him so close she could feel his heart hammering against her ribs, or maybe that was her own heart. She couldn't tell anymore where his fear ended and hers began. "You're lying." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. 32 years of being underestimated had taught her how to sound calm when the ground was falling away beneath her feet. "I don't know you. I've never seen you before in my life." "No." The man in the black overcoat studied her the way you'd study a door you were about to walk through, patient, unbothered by her defiance. "But I've known about you for 5 years, Miss Tacta, since the day the adoption agency handed you a boy who was never legally theirs to give." Around them, the terminal kept moving, a family wheeling matching suitcases toward security, a young couple arguing softly about a gate change, an announcement in Korean, and then English about a flight to Narita. All of it happening in some other world. Some world where Cheryl Takta was still just a pastry chef trying to get her son home. In this world, 6 men in black suits had drawn into a loose half-circle behind their boss, close enough that she understood, with a cold clarity, that she was not going to be allowed to simply walk away. "My name is Cho Young-sik," he said it the way a man says a fact, not an introduction. "And that boy behind your legs is my son." Jack's grip on her coat went tighter. She could feel him trembling, and something in her chest cracked wide open, because whatever this man wanted, whatever game he thought he was playing, her son was 5 years old and terrified, and that was the only fact that mattered to her. "Jack is my son," she said, and now her voice did shake, but not from fear, from fury. "I have raised him every single day of his life. I have rocked him through fevers. I have sat up with him after nightmares. Whatever paper you think you have, whatever test, it doesn't change one single thing about who that boy belongs to." Something flickered across Young-sik's face then, not anger, something closer to respect, though she was too frightened to name it as that yet. He reached into his coat, slow, deliberate, the way a man moves when he doesn't want to be misunderstood as reaching for a weapon, and produced a slim folder. He didn't hand it to her. He simply opened it, angled toward her, close enough that she could see the header at the top of the page. Genetic Comparative Analysis. Subject A Young-sik, Cho/Subject B minor, DOB redacted. "The adoption agency you used," he said quietly, "was a front. It has been for 11 years. Your son was not surrendered by a birth mother in Dijian, the way the papers say. He was created using materials stolen from me and from my wife before she died. He was placed with you because you were unremarkable. A foreigner, no family in country, no connections, no one who would ever think to question the paperwork of a grieving pastry student desperate for a child." The words landed like stones, dropped one by one into still water, each one sending out a wave that reached her a half-second after the last. Stolen. Created. Placed. She had read every page of Jack's adoption file 100 times over the years, had memorized the small, human details in it, the birth weight, the time of delivery, the note about the birth mother's love of jazz music that she used to tell Jack as a bedtime story, even though she'd never known if it was true. And now this stranger was standing under a flickering departure board telling her all of it had been a lie built specifically to make her not ask questions. What kind of people build a lie that careful, that patient, just to hide a child in plain sight? "You're insane," she said, but even as she said it, something cold moved through her, a memory she'd buried on purpose, the irregularity she'd noticed in Jack's papers years ago, a signature that didn't quite match, a clinic name that didn't exist when she'd tried to look it up. She had told herself it didn't matter. She had wanted a son so badly that she had let it not matter. "I wish I were," Young-sik said, and for the first time his voice lost some of its stone. "My wife died carrying our first child. What was taken from the clinic afterward was taken without my knowledge, without my consent, by people inside my own organization who saw a 5-year-old boy as leverage instead of a life. That boy is the only piece of her I have left in this world. And there are men right now, tonight, trying to find him so they can use him to destroy me." Cheryl felt Jack press his face into the back of her leg, hiding the way he did when thunderstorms rolled through Seoul, and something in her simply refused to let this man's grief become her problem, no matter how real it looked on his face. "Then you go deal with your enemies," she said, low and hard. "We are getting on that plane." "Look at the flight board, Ms. Takta." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "It says delayed, but it isn't weather and it isn't mechanical. My men bought every remaining seat on that aircraft 2 hours ago. There is no flight to Chicago tonight. There may not be one for either of you ever again if the men hunting your son find you outside these walls." She looked past him then, really looked, and understood for the first time that the 6 men behind him weren't dressed like criminals from a movie. They were dressed like men who did this so often it had become a uniform, unremarkable, forgettable, exactly the kind of men who could stand in an international airport and not draw a single second glance from security. She thought of the black car outside her bakery, the man with the newspaper, the silence on the phone line. She had told herself for 3 weeks that she was being paranoid, that grief and loneliness were playing tricks on a single mother's nerves. She had not been paranoid. She had been right. She had simply been wrong about who was hunting her. "You think you were fleeing a stalker," Yongsik said, watching the realization move across her face. "But you were running straight into their trap. A commercial flight, a public gate, a manifest with your real name on it. They would have known exactly where to find you both the moment you cleared security." Jack whimpered against her leg, and that sound broke something loose in her chest, the last thread of denial finally snapping. She dropped to a crouch, pulling him into her arms fully, feeling his small heart racing against her own. And in that moment, every instinct she had, the fierce, stubborn, hyper-independent instinct that had carried her alone across an ocean, and built a bakery out of nothing, and raised a son without asking anyone for help, screamed at her to run anyway, to fight, to find some way out of this terminal that didn't involve trusting a stranger with a tattoo curling up his neck like a warning. But there was nowhere to run to, not tonight. "Step into the car," Yongsik said, quiet now, almost gentle, though the 6 men behind him didn't move an inch. "Or we both watch this terminal become a war zone the moment the wrong person walks through that door. I am not asking you to trust me, Ms. Takta. I am asking you to keep him alive until morning." Cheryl looked down at her son's face, at the fear in those dark eyes that had always seemed too old for a 5-year-old, and understood, with a mother's terrible clarity, that for the first time in 5 years, she had run out of options that didn't require putting her fate in someone else's hands. She stood. She did not let go of Jack, and she did not look away from Cho Yong-sik's face as she finally spoke. "If anything happens to my son," she said, "I don't care who you are or how many men you have standing behind you. You will answer to me." Something that might have been the beginning of respect settled into his expression. He turned toward the terminal doors without another word, and his men fell into step, and Cheryl Takta walked forward into the unknown with her son's hand locked in hers, telling herself this was survival, not surrender, not yet knowing it was the first step into a life she never could have imagined standing at that gate. If you felt that fire in Cheryl when she stood her ground, that's the kind of strength I want you carrying into the next story too. While Jack and Cheryl's world is just getting started, I want to tell you about 2 other unforgettable novels waiting for you right now, stories about love, loss, and the kind of hope that gets you through the hardest nights, and they're on sale for a limited time. One will break your heart. The other will heal it. If you're watching this on your TV, grab your phone and scan the QR code right on your screen. Everyone else, the link is in the description and pinned in the comments below. Go get your copy before the discount ends. You deserve a story that makes you feel something too. Now, let's get back to Cheryl and Jack. He answered her without turning around, his voice carrying back over his shoulder as the armored car pulled through a gate that seemed to swallow itself shut behind them. "You will not need to hunt me down, Ms. Takta. If anything happens to your son, there will be nothing left of me for you to find." Cheryl didn't know if that was supposed to comfort her. It didn't. Nothing about the last 20 minutes had comforted her. Not the black car with its bulletproof windows thick as her wrist. Not the silent men flanking it front and back like a funeral procession. Not the way the Seoul skyline had dropped away below them as the road climbed higher and higher into hills she'd never had a reason to visit in 5 years of living in this city. Jack was asleep against her chest now, worn out from fear the way small children get worn out, his breath warm and even against her collarbone, and she held him like he might be taken from her the second she loosened her grip. The car slowed. Ahead of them, gates opened, real gates, iron and thick as a man's leg, set into a wall that ran the length of a city block and disappeared into landscaped hillside on either side. Beyond them, floodlights lit up a compound that looked less like a home and more like something built by people who expected, someday, to need to defend it. Cheryl counted cameras without meaning to. 1 over the gate, 2 more along the drive. A guard tower, half hidden behind ornamental pines, that she would have missed entirely if she hadn't spent the last 3 weeks of her life learning to notice things she used to walk past. "These walls aren't meant to keep you in," Yongsik said, watching her take it in from the seat across from her. "They are engineered to keep an army out." "And which one am I?" she said quietly, so as not to wake Jack, "the army or the thing you're protecting?" He didn't answer that. The car came to a stop beneath a covered entryway, and 2 more guards stepped forward to open the doors, and Cheryl found herself being escorted. That was the word for it. Escorted, not welcomed, into a house so large it took her a full minute of walking through marble hallways to understand she was inside one building and not several stitched together. She kept Jack against her shoulder the entire time. She did not let anyone take him from her, not even when a woman in a gray uniform reached for him, murmuring something in Korean that was probably kind and probably meant to help, and that Cheryl did not care about in the slightest. "He stays with me," she said, and something in her voice must have carried, because the woman stepped back immediately and did not try again. Young-sik led them up a wide staircase to a hallway on the 2nd floor, past doors that stayed closed, past a window that looked out over the city glittering far below. Seoul laid out like a field of stars that had fallen and forgotten how to get back up, and stopped in front of a room done up in soft creams and blues. A bed too big for one small boy. A window with bars disguised as decorative iron scrollwork that Cheryl clocked immediately for what it was. "You'll stay here," he said. "Both of you. There are guards at every entrance to this floor, at every entrance to this house, and around the perimeter of the property. Nothing gets to him that I don't allow first. And who's going to protect him from you?" The question came out sharper than she meant it, but she didn't take it back. Young-sik studied her for a long moment, and something crossed his face that might have been tired amusement, might have been respect, might have been something with no name yet. "Sleep with your eyes open, Chairman Cho," she said, laying Jack down gently on the bed, smoothing his hair back from his forehead without looking away from the man in the doorway. "Because I won't hesitate if you touch my son." "I don't intend to touch him," Young-sik said. "I intend to keep him alive. There's a difference, and before this is over, you'll understand it." He left her then, and for the first time since the airport, Cheryl allowed herself to sit down on the edge of the enormous bed and simply shake, quietly, the way you shake after you've held it together in front of people who cannot be allowed to see you fall apart. Jack stirred beside her, murmured something about the airplane, about Grandma Lagos. No, wrong, Chicago. Her mother was in Chicago, and even that small correction in her own head made her feel like she was losing her grip on the life she'd built. She pulled the blanket over her sleeping son and sat in the dark, listening to a house full of strangers breathing around her. She did not sleep. She got up instead, quiet as she could manage, and moved to the window. Below, in the floodlit courtyard, she could see men moving in slow, deliberate patrols, the kind of walking that wasn't casual, that was counting something, steps, minutes, angles. A dog handler crossed the far end of the yard with a German shepherd on a short lead. Somewhere beyond the wall, past the tree line, the city went on with its ordinary night, people ordering late dinners and hailing taxis and living lives that hadn't been appended by a stranger's voice in an airport terminal. And Cheryl felt, for the first time, the true size of the distance between herself and everyone she used to be. A soft knock came at the door sometime later. She'd lost track of how long she'd been standing there, and when she opened it, Young-sik was alone, no guards flanking him this time, a tray in his hands with tea she hadn't asked for. "You should eat something," he said. "Or drink, at least. It's been a long night." "I don't want your tea." She kept her voice low, aware of Jack sleeping behind her. "I want to know why, not the file, not the medical language. Why my son? Why now tonight at that gate, after 5 years of you knowing exactly where we were and doing nothing?" He set the tray down on a side table without being invited in, and for a moment he simply looked past her, at the small shape of the sleeping boy under the blanket, with an expression she recognized because she'd worn it herself, in the dark, alone, more nights than she could count. "Because until 3 weeks ago," he said quietly, "the men hunting him didn't know he existed either. They found out the same way I did, through the clinic records, through people I trusted who are no longer people I trust. The moment they knew, you and your son became the most valuable thing in Seoul to 2 different groups of dangerous men. I was not protecting you from myself, Ms. Takta. I was buying time to protect you from them." Then how did they find out at all, after 5 years buried in falsified paperwork? Who broke that silence, and why now? The question sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't swallow or spit out, and she watched his face for some flicker of an answer he wasn't giving her, some name he was choosing not to say. The men outside this gate, he went on before she could push further, don't want ransom. Ransom is for people who want money. They want his blood, Ms. Tacta, his existence, proof of it, evidence that can be used to destroy my legacy and take everything my organization controls. A 5-year-old boy is worth more to them dead and documented than alive and hidden. That is what you ran into at that airport. That is what these walls are for. Cheryl looked past him, down the long marble hallway lit by soft recessed lighting, at the closed doors and the silent men she now understood were not staff but soldiers, and felt something close around her chest like a fist. She had spent 5 years building a life small enough and quiet enough that no one would ever look at it twice. And in one night, all of it, the bakery, the apartment, the ordinary Tuesdays, had been peeled back to reveal that she had never been hidden at all. She had been placed. Positioned. Watched, from a distance, by people patient enough to wait 5 years for the right moment to reach for what they wanted. I want to see the medical file again, she said finally. All of it, not the version you decide to show me a page at a time. You'll see it, he nodded once, moving toward the door. Then he stopped, hand on the frame, and looked back at her with something almost gentle beneath the exhaustion in his face. There's a mark on his left collarbone, small, shaped like a crescent. You've probably always thought it was a birthmark, nothing more. Cheryl's breath caught. She had wondered about that mark 100 times over the years, had asked a pediatrician about it once and been told it was nothing, common, meaningless. Check it again tonight, while he sleeps, Yongsik said quietly. I've carried the same one in the same place for 38 years. It isn't a birthmark, Ms. Tacta. It's the only proof I have left that runs through both our bloodlines instead of through paperwork anyone can forge. He left her standing in the doorway with that sentence hanging in the air, and Cheryl turned back toward the bed where her son slept, unaware that he was carrying a mark on his body that had outlived a war he didn't know he was already a part of, and her hands were shaking as she reached for the collar of his pajama shirt to look. There it was, a small crescent, pale against Jack's brown skin, just below his left collarbone, exactly where Yongsik said it would be. And Cheryl sat frozen with her fingers still resting against her son's shoulder, staring at a mark she'd seen 1,000 times over 5 years and never once truly looked at, because looking at it meant asking a question she hadn't been ready to answer. She didn't get the chance to sit with it. Jack's body went rigid beneath her hand, and before she could pull back, he was screaming. It wasn't the ordinary cry of a child startled awake. It was a raw, tearing sound, the kind that came from somewhere too deep for a 5-year-old to have built on his own, and his small hands flew up in front of his face like he was warding off something only he could see. No, no, don't. It's cold, please. His eyes were open but not seeing her, fixed on some point in the air above the bed, and his whole body shook with a violence that terrified her more than anything Cho Yongsik had said to her at that airport gate. Jack, baby, I'm here. She gathered him against her chest, rocking, the way she had rocked him through fevers and thunderstorms for 5 years, but this time her voice alone wasn't reaching him. He fought against her arms, small fists striking at nothing, still trapped somewhere she couldn't follow him. The door opened without a knock. Yongsik crossed the room in 3 strides, and for the first time since the terminal, Cheryl saw something in his face that had nothing to do with control. No calculation, no stillness, just a raw and unguarded fear that made him look, for a moment, like any other frightened parent. Jack! His voice was low, steady, nothing like the whisper that had stopped her cold at the gate. He crouched at the side of the bed, keeping his distance from the boy's flailing arms, and repeated the name again, softer. Jack, you're safe. No needles here, no lights, just the dark and your mother and me. Something in the rhythm of his voice, patient, unhurried, entirely unlike the terror in the boy's memory, seemed to reach where Cheryl's had not. Jack's screaming broke into ragged sobbing, and his small body went slack against her, exhausted, shaking, his fingers finally uncurling from the fists he'd been holding. He isn't having bad dreams, Yongsik said quietly, watching the boys breathing slow. He's remembering the clinic where they kept him, the sedation room. The lights they use for infant procedures never turn off completely, even in sleep. That kind of light burns itself into a body's memory. I've seen it in survivors before. It doesn't fade because you tell yourself it isn't real. Cheryl held her son tighter, pressing her lips to the top of his head, and felt something hot rise in her throat, not just fear anymore, but a fury so complete it left no room for anything else. "He was a baby," she said, her voice cracking. "Whatever they did to him, he was a baby. He shouldn't remember any of it." "The body remembers even when the mind can't," Young-sik said. "That's the cruelest part." They sat like that for a long while, the three of them in the low lamplight, Jack's sobs slowing into hiccups and then into the loose, heavy breathing of a child finally exhausted past fear. Cheryl watched Young-sik across the bed, this man who 12 hours ago had blocked her path in an airport with 6 armed men at his back, now sitting on the floor of a child's bedroom with his knees drawn up like he belonged there, and she didn't know what to do with the contradiction of him. If he lost people to this same darkness before, why does he still keep men in his organization he clearly can't fully trust? Who exactly is left standing close enough to him to have leaked the truth about Jack in the first place? "You hold him like a father," she said finally, quiet, testing the words in her mouth the way you test ice before you put your full weight on it. "But can you protect him like a mother? Because loving him from a safe distance behind guarded walls isn't the same as what I've done every single day for 5 years. Young-sik didn't flinch from the question, though something in his jaw tightened. "No," he admitted. "I can't. I've never done what you've done. I don't know how to comfort a nightmare, how to know which cry means hungry and which means hurt, how to make a 5-year-old believe the world is safe when you know for a fact it isn't. I only know how to keep the walls standing. You're right to doubt that's enough." It was the first honest thing he'd said to her since the terminal, and it landed harder than any of the threats had. "I lost one family to these shadows," he went on, his voice dropping lower, rougher, like the words cost him something to say out loud. "My wife, the child we were supposed to raise together. I told myself for years I would never let anything close enough to hurt me that way again. That distance was the only kind of safety I understood how to build. And then 5 years ago, a corrupt clinic put my blood into a stranger's womb without asking either of us. And somehow, out of that theft, this boy exists. I will burn every last piece of my organization to the ground, every man loyal to the traitors hiding inside my own ranks, before I let them finish what they started with my wife." Jack stirred faintly in her arms, murmuring something in his sleep, and reached out one small hand, not toward Cheryl, who he'd been clinging to all night, but toward Young-sik, who was closest. His fingers found the man's hand and curled around 2 of his fingers, the exact way he'd held onto Cheryl's hand walking through the terminal that morning, trusting and unconscious and entirely unafraid. Young-sik went very still. He looked down at the small hand wrapped around his own like he'd forgotten, for a moment, how to breathe. "His hand fits right inside mine," he said, so quietly it was almost to himself, "just like mine used to fit in my father's." He didn't move to pull away. "I haven't let anyone hold on to me like that in 5 years." Cheryl watched the 2 of them, the boy she'd raised with everything in her, and the man whose blood ran through him whether either of them had chosen it or not, and felt the fierce, defended wall she'd built around her own heart crack somewhere she couldn't immediately name. She didn't trust him. She told herself she didn't, even as she watched him sit motionless on the floor of her son's room, so as not to disturb the small hand holding his fingers, patient in a way she hadn't expected from a man who commanded armed guards with a whisper. "I still don't know if I believe a word you've told me," she said finally. "I know," Young-sik said. "I'm not asking you to, not yet." They sat in silence after that, the lamp burning low, Jack's breathing evening out into real sleep between them, and for the first time since the airport, Cheryl let herself wonder just for a moment, just in the dark, where no one but this stranger could see her do it, whether surviving this might require something harder than staying strong alone. It might require trusting a man she had every reason not to. Tell me the truth in the comments. If you'd been standing at that gate in Cheryl's shoes, would you have trusted Cho Young-sik that first night, or would you have fought your way past those 6 men no matter the cost? I want to know where you stand before we go any further into this house of secrets. That question about trust followed her out of Jack's room and down 2 flights of stairs before she even realized her feet had made the decision on their own. carrying her toward the one place in this enormous, unfamiliar house where she still knew how to be herself. The kitchen, when she found it, nearly stopped her in the doorway. Miles of pristine steel counter, a range with more burners than her entire old shop had possessed, refrigeration units that hummed with the quiet confidence of equipment that had never once been asked to work hard for what it produced. It was beautiful and it was sterile, and it looked exactly like every other room in this compound, expensive, guarded, untouched by an actual life being lived in it. Cheryl stood there in her borrowed robe at 1 a.m. and felt something in her chest settle for the first time since Gate 15. This, she thought, this I know how to do. She found flour in a pantry stocked like a hotel kitchen, found butter and eggs and brown sugar, and by the time she'd tied a dish towel around her waist for lack of an apron, her hands had already started remembering rhythms they'd known since she was 9 years old, standing on a step stool beside her grandmother in Chicago, watching biscuit dough come together under palms too small to really be helping. She didn't turn on the overhead lights. The one above the stove was enough, warm and low, and in that small circle of gold she rolled out dough for peach hand pies the way her grandmother had taught her. And somewhere in the middle of the second batch, she realized she'd stopped shaking for the first time in 18 hours. She didn't hear him come in. She felt it, a shift in the air, a presence at the doorway that had learned, apparently, how to move through his own house like a man who expected to surprise people. And old habits die hard even at 1 a.m. in a stranger's kitchen with your whole world upside down. "Can't sleep?" Yongsik asked. "Haven't tried." She didn't look up from the dough. There's only so much lying awake staring at unfamiliar ceilings a person can do before they need to do something with their hands. He came further into the room, and she watched from the corner of her eye as he took in the flour dusting the counter, the butter-stained towel, the neat rows of pastries cooling on a rack she'd found tucked into a lower cabinet like it had been waiting there, unused, for someone who actually knew what to do with it. He'd traded the black overcoat for a plain dark sweater, no tie, no armor of tailoring, and without it he looked younger somehow, or maybe just more tired, the kind of tired that came from carrying something heavy for a very long time. "You found the good flour," he said, and there was something almost like humor in it. "I find good flour everywhere I go. It's a gift." She kept working the dough, folding it, turning it, the motion as natural to her as breathing. "Don't just stand there looking like you've never seen a kitchen used for its actual purpose. Wash your hands if you're going to hover." He raised an eyebrow, and for a moment she thought he might refuse, a man who commanded armies with a whisper, being told to wash his hands like a schoolboy. But instead he crossed to the sink without a word, rolled his sleeves back, and returned to stand across the counter from her, waiting like he genuinely didn't know what came next. "Fold it in half," she said, sliding a portion of dough toward him. "Then turn it a quarter and fold it again, gently. This isn't a fight, it's a conversation." He tried and failed, pressing too hard, and the dough tore under his palm in a way that made her laugh, a real laugh, surprised out of her, the first one since she'd stepped off her old life at that airport gate. "A mafia boss who can't handle flour," she said, shaking her head, "is no threat to me in this kitchen." "I've been told I have other strengths," he said, and there was the ghost of something almost like a smile at the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. They worked in silence for a while after that, her correcting his technique, him getting steadily less terrible at it, and the quiet between them stopped feeling like the careful silence of strangers sizing each other up, and started feeling like something closer to peace. Outside the tall windows, floodlights still washed over the guarded perimeter, and somewhere beyond that a war was being planned by men who wanted her son dead for what he represented. But in here, in this small circle of warm light, none of it could quite reach them. "This flour," she said eventually, brushing a dusting of it from her wrist, "is the only clean thing in this entire compound." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face shifted, the careful composure cracking just slightly at the seams. "My wife used to say something like that. That baking was the only time the world stood still. She wasn't good at it, burned more than she ever finished, but she loved the stillness of it, the waiting, the not being able to rush anything." Cheryl's hands slowed on the dough. She hadn't expected him to offer that up unprompted, hadn't expected the raw, unguarded grief sitting plainly on his face in a way it hadn't at the airport, hadn't even fully in Jack's room hours earlier. "What was her name?" she asked, gently, the way you ask a question you already suspect might cost the other person something to answer. "Min Young," he said it quietly, like the syllables still held weight after all these years. "She would have been 36 this year. She wanted 6 children. I used to tell her that was ambitious for a woman married to a man in my line of work." A pause. "She never got to meet a single one of them." "And what happened to the child she was carrying? The one Young-sik mentioned in Jack's room? Is there anything left of that pregnancy beyond grief? Or does the story go somewhere Cheryl hasn't been told yet?" Cheryl set down the rolling pin. She thought of her own mother, 3 years gone now, of standing in a Chicago hospital room holding a hand that had taught her everything about flour and butter and patience, and of the particular loneliness of grief that nobody who hasn't carried it can fully understand. "I lost my mother right before I came to Seoul," she said. "Cancer. Fast, at the end, faster than any of us were ready for. I threw myself into culinary school because I didn't know what else to do with all that love I still had and no one left close enough to give it to. Then I got Jack, and it made sense again, having someone to pour it into." "That's why you fight so hard for him," Young-sik said. It wasn't a question. "That's why I'll fight anyone who tries to take him from me," she corrected, meeting his eyes fully for the first time all night. "Including you, if it comes to that." "I don't doubt it." And there was no threat in the way he said it. If anything, there was something like admiration, quiet and real. He looked down at the tattoo curling from beneath his sweater collar, self-conscious in a way she hadn't seen from him before, like he was suddenly aware of how he must have looked to her at that gate, cold and carved from stone. "You're not as cold as that tattoo on your neck makes you look," she said, before she could stop herself, and immediately wished she could take back how much warmth had crept into her voice saying it. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or the particular vulnerability of a man unused to being seen clearly by anyone. He opened his mouth to respond, and that was the exact moment every light in the kitchen died at once, plunging the room into total darkness, the low hum of the refrigeration units cutting off mid-breath, and somewhere far off in the compound, an alarm began to wail. If you stood with Cheryl in that kitchen tonight, if you believe a mother's strength deserves to be protected, not tested, type "protect Jack" in the comments right now, because I promise you, she is about to need every single one of you behind her. The alarm didn't stop. Before the last note of it finished bouncing off the marble hallways, Young-sik had already moved, not toward Cheryl, not toward comfort, but toward the wall panel by the kitchen door, keying in a code with the fast, practiced hands of a man who had run this exact drill more times than he'd ever wanted to. "Stay behind me," he said, and the warmth that had been in his voice 30 seconds earlier, talking about flour and his wife's laughter, was gone entirely, replaced by something clipped and controlled. Backup lighting flickered on along the baseboards, dim amber strips just bright enough to navigate by, and in that half-light Cheryl saw him for exactly what he was, not the man who'd stood in her son's doorway with his knees drawn up, but the chairman of an organization that men were willing to kill and die for. Boots sounded in the hallway. A man appeared in the doorway a moment later, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, wearing the same dark uniform as the rest of the guards, but carrying himself with the weight of someone who gave the orders rather than took them. "Chairman," he didn't spare Cheryl a glance, his focus entirely on Young-sik. "It's not a breach here. It's a diversion, power grid, nothing more, already rerouting. But I need 5 minutes." "Report," Young-sik said, and Cheryl watched the two men fall into a rhythm that told her this wasn't the first crisis they'd weathered together. "Ms. Takta's bakery," the man said, and now his eyes did flick to her, brief and assessing. "2 vehicles, unmarked, parked outside it for the last 40 minutes. Our contact confirms men matching the description of Deputy Hand's people went through the service entrance 10 minutes ago. They're not looking for product, Chairman. They're looking for anything with her name on it, leases, employee records, anything that tells them where she might have people left to reach through. The floor seemed to tilt under Cheryl's feet. "That's my bakery," she said, and her voice came out steadier than the sudden roar in her ears suggested it should. "That's 5 years of my life. My staff, is anyone still there? Is anyone in danger?" "The shop's been closed for 2 days, since the sale finalized," the man said, not unkindly. "No staff on the property tonight, but they know it's hers, and they're using it to build a picture of everyone she might run to if she got out of these walls." "Secure it," Yongsik said. "Full extraction team, non-destructive if possible, but if it comes to a choice between the property and the men inside it, the property burns. I don't want a single name, a single piece of paper connected to her, left in that building by morning." "Understood." The man, Master Sergeant Bio, Cheryl would learn his name properly later, though right now he was simply the second stern, capable stranger to walk into her upended life in 24 hours. Turned to go, already speaking into a radio clipped at his collar. "Wait!" Cheryl stepped forward before either man could dismiss her from the room the way they'd apparently already decided to. "I want to be part of this." Bio actually stopped, glancing at Yongsik with an expression that asked a silent question. Yongsik's jaw tightened. "Cheryl." "Don't." She held up a hand, and something in the set of her shoulders made even Bio take half a step back. "Don't you dare stand there in your own kitchen, after everything you told me an hour ago about needing someone who knows how to comfort a nightmare, and then turn around and bench me the second there's a real decision to make. That's my building. My employees, some of whom still call me to check in even though the sale's done. My city for 5 years, whether either of you wants to admit it or not. I know which supplier deliveries come at odd hours and which don't. I know the false panel behind the walk-in freezer where I used to keep the safe. I know things your men will waste 20 minutes discovering on their own." "This isn't a kitchen," Yongsik said, low and hard. "This is my organization's operational security, and the men inside your shop right now would put a bullet in you without hesitation if given the chance." "Don't bench me, Chairman." She used the title deliberately, watched it land, watched something flicker behind his eyes at the sound of it in her mouth. "I know how those cowards operate better than your guards do, because I spent 3 weeks watching them circle before you ever showed up to tell me what they wanted. You want to protect me, fine. Protect me by trusting that I'm not made of glass." For a long moment, nobody in the room moved. Bio's radio crackled faintly at his shoulder, forgotten. Yongsik studied her the way he had at the airport gate, that first assessing look, except now there was something else layered underneath it, something that had nothing to do with bloodlines or DNA tests, and everything to do with the particular, dangerous respect a man develops for a woman who refuses to be managed. "Fine," he said finally. "You'll be in the operations room. You'll advise. You will not be anywhere near that building tonight." It wasn't everything she wanted, but it was more than she expected, and she nodded once, sharp, and followed as he strode from the kitchen with Bio falling into step on his other side, the warm hour of flour and grief and dough forgotten under the cold amber emergency lighting. The operations room, when they reached it, looked nothing like the rest of the house, banks of monitors, a wall of feeds cycling through camera angles she didn't recognize, men speaking low and fast into headsets. Cheryl stood at the edge of it feeling like an intruder in her own crisis, watching a small red marker blink on a digital map over a street she'd walked 5 mornings a week for half a decade. "They raided her bakery at midnight," Bio said, watching the feed as it resolved into grainy night vision footage. "They know she's the key to reaching you, Chairman. This wasn't opportunistic. This was planned to the hour." Cheryl's stomach turned over as she watched 3 shapes move through her own storefront on the screen, flashlights cutting through the dark space where she used to proof dough before sunrise, where she'd hung a photo of her mother behind the register that she hadn't had the heart to take down even after the sale. A stranger's gloved hand swept it off the wall and let it fall. Who exactly is Deputy Han, and why does even Yongsik's own second-in-command say that name with a kind of caution that sounds less like fear of an enemy and more like fear of someone who used to be family? "If anything happens to her shop," Yongsik said, low enough that only Cheryl and Bio could hear it, but with a heat underneath the words that hadn't been there a moment ago. I'll tear this organization apart myself, starting with whoever inside my ranks is still feeding Han information he shouldn't have. Chairman, Bio's voice carried a warning. Careful. I am done being careful, Sergeant. I was careful for 5 years, and it nearly cost me both of them tonight. His eyes cut briefly to Cheryl, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with strategy, something raw and unguarded, the same look he'd worn in the kitchen before the lights went out, except sharpened now by fear for her instead of grief for someone already lost. Cheryl felt it land in her chest, unwelcome and undeniable. She had spent 5 years building walls precisely so that no man's fear for her safety could ever mean this much, and here she was, standing in a stranger's operations room, feeling something crack open at the sound of a mafia chairman threatening to burn his own empire down over the theft of a photograph. I hired you to protect us, she said quietly, and it came out sharper than she intended, defensive in the particular way she got when she felt something she hadn't given herself permission to feel. Not to make me feel safe in your arms, Cho. I need you thinking clearly right now, not standing here looking at me like that. You didn't hire me for anything, he said, and there was the ghost of dark humor in it even now, even here. I came to you, remember. Then act like it, she said, and turned back to the monitors before he could see exactly how much heat had risen to her own face, watching gloved hands ransack the one place in Seoul that had ever truly belonged to her, while somewhere behind her, a man she had every reason not to trust stood close enough that she could feel the warmth off him in the cold, humming dark of the operations room. If tonight's chapter had your heart racing right alongside Cheryl's, imagine what it feels like to lose yourself completely in a full-length story built the same way, love that sneaks up on you when you least expect it, and grief that finally finds its healing. Right now, 2 unforgettable novels are bundled together at a limited-time discount, one that will break your heart and one that will mend it right back. If you're watching on your TV tonight, pick up your phone and scan the QR code on your screen. Everyone else, the link is waiting for you in the description and pinned in the comments. Don't let tonight end without giving yourself a story of your own to fall into. Go grab your copy before the discount disappears. Now, let's get back to Cheryl. She never got the chance to finish acting like anything at all. 1 second the monitor wall glowed steady with a dozen quiet camera feeds, and the next, every screen in the operations room went black at once, plunging the room into a darkness so total that for one disorienting heartbeat Cheryl couldn't tell up from down. The lights didn't go out because of a storm. Bio's voice cut through the black, sharp and already moving. We have a breach on the north lawn. Emergency lighting kicked in a half-second later, dim red strips along the floor throwing everyone's face into harsh, half-lit relief, and the room that had felt controlled and clinical 30 seconds ago erupted into motion. Men grabbing weapons from a rack along the wall, voices overlapping in Korean and English. A siren different from the one that had wailed in the kitchen, lower, more insistent, the sound of a house that knew the difference between a diversion and a real attack. Jack! The word tore out of Cheryl before she'd even finished processing what was happening, and she was already moving, shoving past a guard toward the door, every cell in her body narrowed down to the single fact that her son was 2 floors up, alone, asleep. Cheryl! Yongsik caught her arm, but she wrenched free without slowing. Don't you dare tell me to stay behind you right now. She was already in the hallway, running, her bare feet slapping against marble gone dark and unfamiliar without the soft, recessed lighting she'd walked through hours earlier. Behind her, she heard him following, heard him barking orders into a radio as he moved. Something about securing the east stairwell, something about the safe room, but none of it mattered to her beyond the fact that Jack's door was still 40 feet away, and every second felt like it was being stolen from her. She hit his room at a dead run. He was sitting bolt upright in bed, eyes huge and terrified in the thin emergency light bleeding under the door, and the second he saw her, he was in her arms, small fists gripping her robe, not crying yet, too frightened even for that. We have to move, baby, right now, okay? Just like we practiced. They hadn't practiced anything, not really, but she said it anyway because some lie in a mother's voice can be more protective than any truth, and Jack nodded against her shoulder, trusting her the way he always had, the way that had never once failed either of them. Young-sik appeared in the doorway a beat later, no longer the composed chairman from the operations room, but something harder, faster, a man with a weapon drawn low at his side, and an expression that had shed every ounce of hesitation. "Safe room, second door past the linen closet, code is 4198. Go. I have men covering the stairwell, but I want you both behind steel in the next 90 seconds. You're not coming with us. I have to know what's inside my walls before I can promise you it stays that way." His eyes held hers for one fraction of a second longer than the situation allowed for, something unspoken passing between them, and then he was gone, moving toward the sound of shouting somewhere below, and Cheryl was alone in the hallway with her son's arms locked around her neck, and a decision to make in the space of a single breath. She ran. The safe room door was heavier than anything she'd ever put her hands to, and her fingers shook so badly punching in the code that she had to try twice before the lock disengaged with a heavy mechanical groan. Inside, the room was small, windowless, lined with supplies she didn't have time to catalog: bottled water, a cot, a bank of monitors dark and useless without power. She pulled Jack inside and reached to seal the door behind them, and that was the exact moment a shape moved in the shadowed hallway behind her, fast, low, closing the distance before she'd even fully registered him as a threat. How did anyone get this deep into the house past a compound, this heavily guarded? Was there truly a breach in the perimeter, or did someone already inside open a door that should have stayed locked? There wasn't time for the question to finish forming before the man was on her, a gloved hand reaching past her for Jack, and every ounce of hyper-independent fury she'd carried across an ocean, and through 5 years of raising a son alone crystallized into something purely physical. Her hand closed around the marble rolling pin she'd carried up from the kitchen without even remembering deciding to bring it, still dusted faintly with flour from an hour that felt like a different lifetime, and she swung it with everything she had. "Touch my son," she snarled, connecting with the side of the man's head hard enough that he staggered, "and you'll find out what a mother with a rolling pin can do." He went down against the doorframe, stunned, and she didn't wait to see if he'd get back up. She hauled Jack fully inside the safe room, threw her whole body weight against the door, and slammed it shut on the sight of the intruder crumpling to the floor of the hallway. The lock engaged with a heavy, final sound, and in the sudden muffled silence, Cheryl stood with her back against steel, rolling pin still gripped white-knuckled in one hand, Jack sobbing quietly against her legs, and realized she was shaking too hard to feel anything except the wild, ragged pounding of her own heart. Minutes passed like hours. She heard nothing through the reinforced door, no gunfire, no shouting, nothing but the muffled thud of her own pulse in her ears and Jack's frightened breathing against her side. She sat down on the floor with him, pulling him into her lap the way she had when he was an infant, and rocked, and prayed in the specific, wordless way of a woman who had learned a long time ago that some fear doesn't have language big enough to hold it. When the lock finally disengaged, she nearly swung the rolling pin again before she recognized the silhouette in the doorway. Young-sik stood there covered in dust, a streak of something dark across his jaw, his shirt torn at the shoulder, breathing hard like he'd run the length of the compound more than once. His eyes found her first, then dropped to Jack curled against her chest, and something in his whole body seemed to unlock at the sight of them both whole and unhurt. "You're bleeding, Cho." She was on her feet before she finished the sentence, rolling pin forgotten, reaching for him despite everything, despite the hours of telling herself she wouldn't let this man matter to her this much. "It isn't my blood, Cheryl." His voice was rough, exhausted, and when she stepped closer, she saw he was telling the truth. No wound on him she could find, whatever had marked his shirt belonging to someone else entirely. "Get in the safe room," he said, even now, even standing in the doorway of it, some part of him still running the protocol he'd built to keep them alive. "I'm not losing either of you tonight." "We're already in the safe room," she said, half laugh, half sob, the adrenaline draining out of her all at once and leaving something raw and shaking in its place. "You're the one standing in the hallway looking like you just walked out of a war." "I did," he said simply, and for a moment neither of them moved, the space between them charged with everything that had nearly been lost in the last 20 minutes. Jack's small life, her own fierce heart, whatever fragile understanding had been building between them since a kitchen full of flour and grief. Then Bio's voice crackled through a radio at Young-sik's shoulder, urgent, cutting through the moment like a blade. "Chairman, you need to see this. We took one of them alive, and Chairman, he's asking for you by name. Says he has a message. Says it's from someone you used to trust." If a stranger had stood between you and your child at that airport gate that first night, tell me honestly, would you have gotten in that car, or would you have found another way to run? I want to hear it in the comments, because Cheryl's about to learn exactly how far into Young-sik's own house the betrayal really goes. Someone he used to trust. The words settled over Young-sik's face like a shadow passing over stone, and for a moment he didn't move at all, didn't answer Bio, just stood in the doorway of the safe room with Jack's small, sleeping weight now transferred into Cheryl's arms, and a war he thought he understood suddenly revealing itself to be something far more personal. "I'll come," he said finally, his voice flat, controlled in the particular way she was learning meant he was holding something back with everything he had. "Give me 10 minutes. Chairman." 10 minutes, Sergeant. The radio went quiet. Young-sik stepped fully into the safe room and closed the door behind him, and for the first time all night, Cheryl watched something in him crack that had nothing to do with the raid, nothing to do with power outages or breached perimeters. He crossed to the small cot along the wall and sat down heavily, like his legs had simply stopped being willing to hold him up any longer, and dropped his head into his hands. "Cho," she said it softly, Jack still asleep against her shoulder, exhaustion finally winning out over terror in her son's small body. "Who is it? Who does he mean?" "I don't know yet." He lifted his head, and his eyes were dark with something that looked almost like dread. "But I have an idea, and if I'm right, it means the man feeding Han information isn't some outside traitor I can simply cut away and be done with. It means it's someone who sat at my table, someone who was there when Minyoung died." Cheryl didn't have words for that kind of grief circling back on itself, betrayal layered over loss layered over more loss, so she didn't offer any. She simply sat down beside him on the narrow cot, Jack's weight anchoring her, and let the silence hold space for what he couldn't yet say. After a moment, Young-sik reached into the inside pocket of his torn jacket and withdrew a folder, thicker than the one he'd shown her at the airport, its edges soft from handling. He held it for a long moment before offering it to her. "You asked me, that first night at the door, to show you everything," he said quietly. "Not a page at a time. I think you need to see it now, before I go down there and find out how deep this actually runs. Because whatever I learn tonight, I don't want you carrying it without understanding what came before." Cheryl shifted Jack carefully off her shoulder onto the cot, tucking a blanket around him, and took the folder with hands that had finally stopped shaking from the fight in the hallway, only to start shaking again for an entirely different reason. "Read the file, Cheryl," Young-sik said low. "See the monsters we are dealing with." She opened it. The first pages were clinical, cold, exactly the kind of language she'd braced herself for: extraction dates, storage protocols, a fertility clinic in Gangnam with a name she recognized only because she'd walked past its glass-fronted building 100 times without ever knowing what it truly was. But it was the pages further in that broke her. A handwritten note, photocopied, from a doctor who should have been struck off years before any of this happened, describing in flat, businesslike terms how material harvested from a grieving widower and his late wife's frozen embryos had been quietly diverted, sold, implanted into a surrogate arrangement dressed up as a legitimate adoption pipeline. A photograph, grainy, time-stamped 5 years ago, of an infant in a hospital bassinet with a small crescent mark already visible below his collarbone, a mark someone had apparently flagged and photographed like evidence, like property, before he'd even opened his eyes to the world. Cheryl's hands went cold. She had held that same small body 100 times, memorized every inch of him, loved him before she'd even fully processed that he was hers to keep. And here, in black and white, was proof that before he'd ever been given to her, he had been catalogued, measured, sold. They didn't even wait for him to be born, she whispered, before they decided what he was worth. No, Young-sik said, they didn't. She turned another page and found herself looking at a photograph of a woman, young, lovely, laughing at something outside the frame, dressed simply, nothing like the polished portraits Cheryl might have expected of a syndicate chairman's wife. Min-young. The resemblance to Jack was there in the eyes, exactly as Young-sik had said at the airport, dark and warm and slightly upturned at the corners. And seeing it laid out in undeniable proof broke something loose in Cheryl that she had been holding together by sheer will since gate 15. She started to cry, not the composed, controlled tears she'd allowed herself in front of him before, but something deeper, something that came from a place she rarely let anyone see. 5 years of carrying a secret fear she'd never spoken aloud even to herself, that somewhere underneath the paperwork irregularities she'd chosen to ignore, there had been something rotten she'd been too desperate for a child to properly question. I knew, she said, the words tearing out of her. I knew something was wrong with those papers years ago, and I let it go because I wanted him so badly I couldn't stand to lose him over it. What does that make me? What kind of mother closes her eyes to something like this because she's too afraid of losing the only family she has left? Did Young-sik's late wife ever know, before she died, that something of theirs had survived beyond her? Or did she go to her grave believing every part of that future had been lost with her? It makes you human, Young-sik said fiercely, and he reached for her hands, folder still open between them, his grip warm and certain in a way that cut straight through her spiraling grief. Listen to me. You didn't steal him. You didn't create the monsters who did this. You took a frightened, motherless infant and you loved him every single day for 5 years. You rocked him through fevers no one paid you to endure. You sat up with his nightmares. You built an entire life around keeping him safe, long before you ever knew there was a war waiting for both of you. But the file tells you how he came into this world, Young-sik said, his voice rough now, urgent. It does not tell you who his mother is. I raised nothing. I fed no one. I never wiped a single tear from that boy's face until 3 days ago. You did all of that. You are his mother, Cheryl, not because of paperwork and not despite it, because you showed up for him every day that it mattered. I raised him, she said, the words coming out broken and fierce all at once. I fed him, I wiped his tears, I am his mother. Yes, Young-sik said, closing the distance between them until there was barely space left for the folder still open on her lap. You are. And no paper, no bloodline, and no doctor who ever laid hands on either of us in secret will take that title away from you. Not while I have breath left in my body. She looked up at him then, tear-streaked and raw in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be in front of another adult in longer than she could remember. And found him watching her with an intensity that made the air in the small room feel suddenly too thin. Why are you looking at me like that? She asked, barely above a whisper. Because, he said, his hand coming up to gently brush a tear from her cheek, lingering there longer than either of them could pretend was accidental. I've never seen anyone braver. Space between them collapsed to nothing, his forehead resting against hers, both of them breathing the same charged air. 5 years of her fierce independence and 38 years of his careful, guarded distance dissolving into something neither of them had the strength left to fight tonight. And just as his hand slid to cradle her jaw, just as the distance between their mouths closed to almost nothing, the safe room door burst open behind them, and Bio stood in the frame, face pale in the emergency light. Chairman, the prisoner talked. You need to hear this now. It's about the message. It's about who sent it. He hesitated, eyes flicking once to Cheryl before settling back on Young-sik with something like dread. It's Master Sergeant Han, your own father's man. He says the syndicate war was never really about control of your territory at all, Chairman. He says it was always about the boy, and he says you already know why. If watching Cho Young-sik lay down every wall he built for the sake of this family had your heart in your throat tonight, smash that like button before you go, because Cheryl deserves every bit of love this comment section can send her way, and we are far from finished with what that man is about to reveal. Already know why. Young-sik repeated the words back to Bio like they'd been lodged in his throat since the war began, and something in his face went still in a way Cheryl had learned to recognize as the calm before he made a decision, he couldn't take back. My father brought Han into this family before I was old enough to understand what family meant in our world. If he's the one who's been feeding Deputy Han information, then this was never really about territory at all. It was about finishing something my father started, and I refused to. He didn't explain further, not that night. Not with Jack finally asleep in the safe room and a prisoner waiting downstairs with a confession that would take 3 more days to fully unravel. What Cheryl understood, by the time the sun rose gray and reluctant over the compound walls, was that the war had a shape now, a name, an address, an abandoned shipping terminal on the western edge of Incheon's harbor, where Han's remaining loyalists were gathering cargo containers full of falsified export manifests, laundering money, and according to the prisoner, preparing one final move against the boy who threatened to end their claim on the syndicate forever. "You're not going," Young-sik said, 3 days later, standing in the operations room in a dark tactical jacket that made him look like a stranger all over again, the warmth of the kitchen and the safe room folded away somewhere she couldn't reach. "I know I'm not going to the dock," Cheryl said, arms crossed, refusing to be moved from where she stood beside the monitor bank. "I've made my peace with that, for Jack's sake if nothing else. But I am not sitting upstairs pretending to sleep while you walk into a shipping yard full of men who want you dead. I know that terminal. My old supplier used it for imports before I switched vendors 2 years ago, the loading bays, the blind corners, which containers actually get inspected, and which ones sail straight through. You want an advantage tonight, Cho. I'm one of the only people in this house who's actually walked that ground." He looked at her for a long moment, and whatever argument he'd been prepared to make died somewhere behind his teeth. The armored van, then, behind the perimeter bio-sets, monitoring the feeds, nothing closer. Fine. It wasn't a victory exactly, but it was enough. The drive to the harbor took 40 minutes through streets gone quiet with the specific hush of 2 in the morning, and Cheryl sat in the back of the armored van, beside a wall of monitors fed by drone cameras, circling high above the terminal, watching grainy infrared shapes move between stacked containers like ghosts. Bio rode up front, radio silent for now, and Young-sik had gone ahead alone in a second vehicle, walking into the meeting Han's men had demanded on the promise that he'd come to negotiate the boy's future in exchange for peace. It was, everyone in that van understood, a lie designed to get him within range. There. Cheryl's finger found movement on the third monitor before anyone else's eye caught it, 2 shapes breaking off from the main group near the loading cranes, moving low and fast toward a service corridor that ran parallel to the meeting point. "Bio, 3rd door on the left, that's not a patrol route, that's a flanking position. Cheryl says there's an ambush waiting." Bio didn't question the read. He keyed his radio immediately, voice low and urgent, rerouting 2 of Young-sik's men toward the corridor before the shapes on the screen could close the distance, and Cheryl felt something settle in her chest that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with purpose. The particular, focused calm of a woman finally allowed to fight for the people she loved, instead of simply being protected from the fight. If Han was loyal to Young-sik's father, loyal enough to be trusted with the family's deepest secrets for decades, then what happened between the 2 of them, father and son, that turned that loyalty into this? A war willing to sacrifice a 5-year-old child to settle it. Below, on the ground, Young-sik walked into the center of the loading yard alone, hands visible, coat open, exactly as agreed. Han emerged from behind a stack of containers a moment later, older than Cheryl had expected, silver-haired, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who had spent 30 years believing himself untouchable inside this family. "You came," Han said, his voice carrying faintly through the directional mic feeding into Cheryl's monitor. "I wondered if you'd have the courage after everything." "You raised me to believe courage meant finishing what you start," Young-sik said. "I'm here to finish this." "Your father would have handled the boy quietly, years ago, before he ever drew breath in this world. You've let sentiment make you weak, Young-sik. A pastry chef and her borrowed son. Is that what 30 years of my loyalty bought your family? A chairman who can't tell the difference between love and liability?" "You thought a child would give you control over my empire," Young-sik said, and even through the tinny feed, Cheryl heard the ice underneath his voice. "You were wrong. That boy isn't leverage, Han. He's the only thing left of a woman you claim to mourn alongside me, and you spent 5 years hunting him instead of protecting the last piece of her I had." Han's expression flickered, something almost like shame, quickly buried under contempt. "Sentiment," he said again, softer this time, like a diagnosis. "It always ends this way with the soft ones." On the monitor, Cheryl watched 3 more shapes emerge from the shadows behind Han, closing the loading yard's exits one by one, and her stomach dropped even as she keyed the radio herself, unable to stay silent a second longer. "Bio, they're boxing him in south exit, south exit. 2 more just came around the crane." "Copy." Bio's voice was calm, professional, already relaying the position to the men moving quietly into place around the yard's perimeter. Men Young-sik had positioned their hours before the meeting ever began, exactly as he'd promised her in the van. This had never been a negotiation. It had been a trap of his own, patient and precise, built to let Han believe he held every card until the exact moment he didn't. "This ends tonight," Young-sik said, his voice carrying clear and steady across the yard even as Han's men closed in around him. Not with bullets, but with handcuffs and total surrender. Han laughed, short and disbelieving, right up until the floodlights along the terminal's perimeter snapped on all at once, flooding the yard in white light and revealing Young-sik's men already positioned at every exit, weapons drawn, federal agents in windbreakers moving in from the water side of the dock, where Cheryl hadn't even known boats had been staged. She realized, watching it unfold on the monitor with her heart hammering against her ribs, that Young-sik hadn't just been protecting his family for the last 5 days. He'd been building this exact moment. Evidence gathered, authorities briefed, every falsified manifest and laundered account Han's people had touched laid out and waiting to be handed over the second the trap closed. "You failed, traitor," Young-sik said, standing perfectly still as agents moved past him to secure Han and his remaining men one by one, the older man's face contorting through disbelief and then fury as handcuffs closed around his wrists. "My family is stronger than your greed. It always was. You simply never had the eyes to see it." Cheryl watched it happen from the safety of the van, hand pressed flat against her chest, and felt something in her that had been braced and coiled for 5 days finally begin to unclench. On the monitor, federal agents led Han toward a waiting vehicle, and Young-sik stood alone in the flooding light of the yard, watching the man who had helped raise him be taken away in chains, his shoulders carrying something that looked less like triumph and more like grief finally allowed to surface. He looked up once, toward the van, toward the direction he knew she was watching from, and even across that distance, even through a grainy monitor feed, Cheryl felt the weight of everything unspoken pass between them. Then Bio's radio crackled again, sharp and urgent, cutting through the relief before it had a chance to settle. "Chairman, we have a problem. Han's financial records just surfaced on our system, and Chairman, there's a name on the original clinic contract we haven't accounted for yet. A second buyer. Someone paid for access to that same genetic material 5 years ago, and it wasn't Han." That second buyer's name had taken Young-sik the better part of a year to fully hunt down and neutralize. A disgraced clinic investor living quietly in Busan, who'd purchased the records purely for blackmail insurance, and folded the moment federal agents came knocking with Han's testimony in hand. But tonight, standing beneath the very same departures board that had once frozen Cheryl's blood cold, none of that darkness followed them through the terminal doors. Gate 15 looked different now. The same fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the same distant announcements drifted through the concourse in Korean and English, but the board above them read "Sold to Chicago, Owen time," and Cheryl found herself standing in almost the exact spot where a stranger in a black overcoat had once told her she wasn't leaving with her son, except this time her hand wasn't clenched white-knuckled around a boarding pass. It was folded easily inside Young-sik's, the way it had been for months now, familiar as breathing. Jack, 6 years old now and taller than she liked to admit, tugged at both their sleeves. "Is this the gate? The one from the story you tell me?" "This is the gate," Cheryl said, smiling despite the sudden thickness in her throat. Over the past year, she'd told him a softened version of that first night, enough truth for a 6-year-old to carry without the weight of what had actually stood at stake. And he'd taken to asking about it, the way children ask about their favorite parts of a fairy tale, wanting to hear it again and again until it became simply a fact of who he was. "We started at this gate as strangers with a secret," Yongsik said, crouching down to Jack's eye level, his voice carrying that particular warmth Cheryl had watched grow steadily louder in him over the past 12 months, uncovering itself from beneath layers of old grief, the way spring uncovers ground that's been frozen a long time. "Your mother didn't trust me one bit that night. She was right not to, at first." "I still don't fully trust airports," Cheryl said, and Jack laughed, the easy, unguarded laugh of a child who slept through the night now, whose nightmares had faded gradually over months of safety and consistency, and 2 parents who took turns sitting by his bed until they stopped being necessary at all. Yongsik straightened, and something in his posture shifted, a nervousness she'd rarely seen in him even in the worst of the war with Han, even standing in a floodlit shipping yard facing down the man who'd helped raise him. "I brought you back here to give you a choice," he said, "not an order. I promised myself that, the first night we walked through these doors together, everything after would be your choice always, no matter what I wanted." "Cho, you're being strange." She said it lightly, but her heart had already begun to climb toward her throat, some instinct recognizing the shape of a moment before her mind caught up to it. He reached into his coat, the same simple gesture he'd made a year ago, presenting a folder that had shattered her entire world, except this time what he withdrew was different. A slim leather folder, yes, but thinner, and beside it, held between 2 fingers with a carefulness that looked almost unfamiliar on a man who commanded armies, a small velvet box. How does a man who spent his entire adult life building walls thick enough to survive a syndicate war find the courage to stand exposed like this, in the very place that once nearly cost him everything he was trying to protect? "These papers," he said, opening the folder first, holding it out so she could see the seal at the top, the language she now recognized after months of legal proceedings that had quietly, deliberately transferred full and permanent guardianship rights into her name alone. No clause, no condition, no bloodline claim standing above hers. "Don't give you motherhood. They never could. They simply tell the world what has always been true: Jack has one mother, and it is you. It was you the day you rocked him through his first fever in a country where you had no family of your own. It was you long before I ever had the right to walk into your life and complicate it." Cheryl's eyes blurred, hot and sudden, and she pressed a hand to her mouth as she took the folder with shaking fingers, scanning lines she'd feared for months might never fully exist, legal, binding, unassailable, her name standing alone where it had always belonged. "And this," Yongsik said, lowering himself onto one knee on the terminal floor, right there beneath the departures board, drawing gasps from travelers passing by who had no idea what history this particular gate carried for the 3 of them. "This isn't for the court. This is for me." He opened the small box. The ring inside caught the terminal's fluorescent light and turned it warm, gold instead of clinical white, and Cheryl felt Jack's hand slip into hers, gripping tight. His small face turned up with an excitement that told her he'd known this was coming, that this whole trip to the airport had been planned around this exact moment, while she'd been kept entirely in the dark. "A year ago I stood in this terminal and told you that you weren't leaving with your son," Yongsik said, his voice rough now, stripped of every careful, controlled edge she'd once mistaken for coldness. "I have never in my life regretted a single sentence more, and never in my life been more grateful for how wrong it turned out to be because it brought me to you. I don't have anything left to protect you from anymore. Han is gone. The clinic is exposed. The second buyer is neutralized. There is no war left standing between us. There is only the choice of whether you want this life, this ordinary, unremarkable, gloriously boring life with me, not as a chairman offering protection, as a man asking for a future." "Why are you asking me this here?" she managed, laughing and crying in the same breath, of all places. "Because this gate almost took everything from both of us," he said, "and I wanted it to be the place that gave everything back instead." Cheryl looked down at Jack, who was grinning up at her with the particular delighted urgency of a 6-year-old who has been sworn to secrecy and can barely stand it a second longer. And then back at the man kneeling in the middle of an airport terminal with her son's entire legal future in one hand and a ring in the other, and felt every wall she had built across 5 years, hyper-independent, defended, certain that needing anyone was the surest way to lose everything, finally. Fully come down. "Are you asking me as a mafia boss, Cho Young-sik?" she asked, half a laugh breaking through the tears. "I'm asking as the man who loves you," he said. "Nothing more, nothing less. Just a man on his knees in an airport hoping you'll say yes." Yes. The word came out before she'd even finished deciding to say it, because some decisions, she realized, don't actually require deciding at all. They simply arrive, whole and certain, the moment you stop fighting what your heart has already known for months. "Yes, Cho, 1,000 times yes." He rose and pulled her into him, and Jack wrapped his arms around both their legs, laughing, and somewhere beyond them the departure board blinked Seoul to Chicago. ON time, a flight neither of them had any intention of boarding, because somewhere in the last year, without either of them fully choosing it, Seoul had stopped being the place she was running from and had quietly, completely become home. If you believe a mother's love outweighs any bloodline, any paperwork, any lie a clinic ever tried to bury, comment, blended family below, because Cheryl and Jack earned every single piece of this ending, and we are not done watching this family build the life they deserve. That flight to Chicago never carried them anywhere that night, and 5 years later, standing on the terrace of a home that had once felt like a fortress and now simply felt like Tuesday, Cheryl understood exactly how far a person could travel without ever leaving the place they'd learned to call home. Below, in the garden that used to hold armed patrols and guard dogs on short leads, string lights hung between the trees, and 40 or so guests moved between long tables loaded with food that told the whole story of the family gathered beneath them. Soul food macaroni beside japchae, peach cobbler cooling next to a tray of songpyeon. Cheryl had finally learned to fold properly under the patient instruction of Young-sik's aunt, who had become, over the years, something close to the grandmother Jack had never had. Balloons in blue and gold spelled out a number that still didn't feel real to her, 10, tied to the railing of a terrace where, once, she had stood in the dark counting guard patrols instead of party guests. "Look at him," Young-sik said beside her, nodding toward the center of the garden, where Jack stood atop a picnic bench, arms crossed, refusing loudly, immovably, to let his cousin cut the first slice of cake before he'd finished making his birthday wish exactly the way he wanted to make it. "He has your stubborn Chicago pride. I've tried for 5 years to talk that boy out of an argument he's already decided to win. It cannot be done." "That's not stubbornness," Cheryl said, laughing, leaning into the warmth of her husband's shoulder. "That's a boy who knows what he wants and isn't afraid to say so. I wonder where he learned that." "From his mother," Young-sik said without hesitation, "who once told a syndicate chairman he'd answer to her personally if anything happened to her son, and meant every word of it." Below them, Jack finally got his way. The cake stayed uncut a full extra minute while he closed his eyes tight and made whatever wish a 10-year-old makes when he has, by any honest measure, already gotten almost everything a heart could want. And the garden erupted in laughter and applause when he finally blew out the candles in one triumphant breath. Master Sergeant Bio, who had traded his tactical gear years ago for the quieter uniform of head of security at Young-sik's, now entirely legitimate logistics company, caught the boy under the arms and swung him around once before setting him down, both of them laughing, easy in a way that still sometimes caught Cheryl off guard. How completely violence had given way, in this particular garden, to nothing more dangerous than a game of tag winding down into cake. "I still think about that first night sometimes," Cheryl said quietly. "How impossible all of this would have sounded to me, standing at that gate. If someone had told me I'd end up here, married to the man who stopped me, raising our son in the same city I once ran from, I'd have called them a liar." "We built something beautiful out of broken glass," Young-sik said, and there was no performance in it, no careful chairman's composure, just a man who had spent a decade learning how to say true things plainly. "I don't think either of us set out to build a family. I think we simply refused to let what was broken stay broken, and somewhere in the refusing, this happened instead. The bakery had opened its third location that spring, tucked into a quiet corner of Itaewon with a line most mornings that stretched halfway down the block. American biscuits and pecan pies sitting proudly in the same case as Korean sweetbreads. A menu that had become, over the years, less a business and more a public declaration of exactly who Cheryl Tacticho had decided to become. Not erased by the life she'd married into, not folded quietly into someone else's world, but fully. Stubbornly herself, with a rolling pin still hanging on the wall of the original kitchen, where a mafia boss had once learned, badly, how to fold dough. Would Jack, watching his parents build something so deliberately whole out of a beginning built on theft and grief, ever feel the pull to understand the biological family history buried in that first medical file? And if he did, someday, would either of them have the strength to hand him that folder without flinching? Below, the party had shifted into the loose, unstructured rhythm of an evening winding down, adults gathering in small clusters with drinks in hand, while the youngest cousins chased each other barefoot across grass that had once been monitored by cameras in every corner. Jack broke away from the group and jogged up the terrace steps, cheeks flushed, a piece of cake balanced precariously on a paper plate. "Are you two just going to stand up here all night?" he asked, grinning, already halfway through the sentence before either of them could answer. "Grandmother wants to know if you're coming down to hear the toast, or if she has to come drag you both herself." "Tell her we're coming," Cheryl said, ruffling his hair despite his immediate, dramatic protest, and Jack darted back down the steps two at a time, shouting something to Bio that made the older man laugh from across the yard. Yongsik didn't move right away. He turned instead, taking Cheryl's hand fully in both of his, the same easy, certain gesture he'd made 1,000 times since that first gate, and looked at her with an expression that still, after everything, could catch her breath in her chest. "From an airport standoff to a lifetime together," he said quietly. "I used to think the most dangerous thing I ever did was walk into that terminal 5 years ago and tell you the truth. I know now the bravest thing either of us ever did was choosing, every single day since, to stay." "You're not going anywhere, Cho," Cheryl said, and it wasn't a question, wasn't even really a statement. It was simply a fact, the kind that had been true for so long now it barely needed saying, except she said it anyway, because some truths deserve to be spoken out loud, again and again, for as long as you're lucky enough to have someone standing there to hear them. "Not a chance, Chairman Cho," she added, laughing, echoing back the title she'd once used like a weapon and now used like an endearment, and he pulled her into him, both of them looking down at the garden full of family they had built out of nothing but stubbornness and love, and a refusal to let the worst night of their lives be the last word on who they were allowed to become. Below, Jack looked up, caught them watching, and waved both arms over his head like he was flagging down a plane, grinning at them the exact way he had grinned at Cheryl the very first time she'd held him, 5 years old and terrified in an airport terminal, not yet knowing that the man standing in their path that night wasn't the ending of their story at all. He was the beginning of the only family either of them had ever truly needed. "Before you go tonight, I want to say something to every one of you who stayed with Cheryl and Yongsik from that first gate all the way to this garden. Thank you. Truly. Stories like this one only get to keep living because women like you show up for them, chapter after chapter, and I don't take that for granted. If their story moved you even half as much as it moved me writing it, there are 2 more waiting for you right now, one built to break your heart wide open, and one built to heal every piece of it back together. If you're watching on your TV, scan the QR code on your screen. Everyone else, the links in the description and pinned in the comments below, on sale for a limited time. Go give yourself that gift tonight. And before you close this out, hit like, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments which chapter of Cheryl and Yongsik's story broke you the most. I read every single one. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I'll see you in the next story.